The merger died 72 hours after they fired the only man trying to stop it. Nobody inside Vail Dynamics understood that yet. Not the board, not the investment bankers, not the smiling executives drinking 12-year scotch beneath the glass skyline of downtown Chicago, while television screens looped financial headlines celebrating what analysts already called the acquisition of the year. $3.9 billion. That number changes how people behave inside corporate America. It makes intelligent executives reckless, and reckless executives dangerous. I sat at the far end of the boardroom table reviewing the final compliance packet while rain moved slowly across the 62nd floor windows overlooking Lake Michigan. The room smelled like expensive coffee, polished walnut, and ambition. Too much ambition. The merger vote was scheduled for exactly 9:30 that morning. By then I had already spent 11 months warning them quietly. Hidden pension exposure. Unresolved federal transportation audits. Artificially inflated logistics projections. Integration assumptions mathematically incapable of surviving a downward cycle. Every issue documented. Every warning timestamped. Nobody wanted to hear any of it anymore. Because truth becomes inconvenient once billions of dollars in executive compensation packages enter the room together. Ethan Vail stood near the presentation screen adjusting his cufflinks confidently, while investment bankers from Manhattan reviewed acquisition forecasts glowing across massive digital displays behind him. 43 years old. Charismatic. Aggressive. Built for financial television interviews and shareholder conferences. Not built for consequences. That difference matters eventually. He smiled toward the board before speaking. Ladies and gentlemen, this merger positions Vail Dynamics as the dominant logistics automation platform in North America. The word dominant lingered in the room like perfume. Executives love words that sound expensive. I remained silent until Ethan shifted toward me directly. Daniel, unless compliance has discovered another theoretical catastrophe overnight, I think we are ready for final authorization. Several board members laughed softly. There it was. The setup. Public humiliation disguised as executive humor. I closed the compliance binder slowly before answering. The pension exposure is not theoretical. Neither is the unresolved federal review tied to Horizon Transit Systems. If acquisition proceeds before full disclosure clarification, the company inherits liabilities capable of triggering regulatory escalation within the next 2 quarters. The room cooled immediately. Not emotionally. Financially. Because nobody inside corporate boardrooms fears morality. They fear uncertainty. One investment banker shifted uncomfortably beside the legal counsel, while Ethan stared at me with the controlled irritation of a man watching someone interfere with his victory lap. Then he smiled again. Daniel has spent 22 years protecting this company from risk. Unfortunately, somewhere along the way, he started confusing caution with leadership. Small laughter again. More uncomfortable this time. He continued walking slowly around the boardroom table. We cannot build a modern company while dragging around institutional deadweight every time growth requires courage. That word landed exactly where he wanted it to. Deadweight. Not disagreement. Not strategic conflict. Deadweight. The independent board member Clara Whitmore looked toward me immediately after he said it. Smart woman. She understood something dangerous had just happened inside the room. Not legally. Structurally. I looked at Ethan calmly across the polished conference table while city lights reflected faintly against the rain-dark glass behind him. Then I answered quietly. Risk does not disappear because executives become impatient with it. Wrong sentence for his ego in that moment. Ethan stopped smiling completely. Then came the decision already prepared before the meeting even started. Effective immediately, your role is terminated. Human resources will coordinate transition details by end of day. No hesitation. No private conversation afterward. Just execution in front of the board, legal counsel, investment bankers, and acquisition advisors. 22 years erased between quarterly earnings projections and merger celebration catering. Interesting thing about executive arrogance. It usually mistakes silence for weakness. I gathered my compliance binder slowly while nobody inside the room spoke anymore. Not because they agreed with Ethan. Because fear spreads fast once leadership humiliates someone publicly. Especially someone who knows where the bodies are buried financially. Before leaving, I placed one sealed document beside Clara Whitmore carefully. Final Risk Escalation Summary. Unread. And signed. Timestamped 8:14 that morning. Then I walked toward the boardroom doors without another word, while merger projections continued glowing behind me in blue and gold across the massive presentation screens. $3.9 billion. Everyone in that room still believed the deal was alive. If you have ever watched executives destroy themselves by ignoring the only honest person in the room, subscribe now. Because 72 hours later, half the people at that table would pretend they never supported the merger at all. The celebration started 30 minutes after I left the building. Champagne arrived first. Then arrogance. By 11:15 that morning, Vail Dynamics released the merger announcement publicly across every major financial platform in the country. CNBC ran the headline beneath glowing market graphics, while analysts praised Ethan Vail for executing what one commentator called the boldest logistics consolidation move of the decade. Inside headquarters, executives moved through the hallways like men who believed gravity no longer applied to them. Stock price up, board satisfied, press enthusiastic. That combination makes intelligent people careless faster than alcohol ever could. Meanwhile, I sat alone inside a quiet coffee shop 4 miles north of downtown, reviewing the final risk escalation summary one last time beside a half-finished black coffee gone cold near my laptop. 27 pages. Every projection sourced. Every liability documented. Every unresolved federal transportation inquiry attached with timestamps and legal references. Not emotional. Mathematical. That is the dangerous thing about real compliance professionals. We do not deal in feelings. We deal in survivability. At 12:47, my company email access terminated automatically. Calendar revoked. File permissions removed. Executive communication channels locked. Standard procedure. Nothing personal. Except this termination had been personal from the beginning. Ethan did not remove me because I was wrong. He removed me because my existence slowed the narrative he wanted Wall Street to believe. There is a difference. A dangerous one. Around 1:30, Clara Whitmore called from a private number. I almost ignored it, then answered anyway. Her voice stayed measured, controlled. Daniel, did you intentionally leave the risk summary with me instead of legal counsel? Interesting question. I looked through the coffee shop window towards slow-moving Chicago traffic beneath darkening afternoon clouds before responding. Legal counsel already saw earlier drafts. The board did not. Silence followed briefly. Then she asked the real question. How serious is the Horizon exposure actually? I answered immediately. Serious enough that the merger should never close without independent federal clarification first. Another pause. Longer this time. Because she believed me. That mattered. Most executives ignore warnings because they think compliance officers exaggerate risk professionally. Clara understood something rarer. Calm people become terrifying when they stop compromising language. Back inside Vail Dynamics, investment bankers spent the afternoon coordinating financing structures tied to the acquisition closing timeline, while external legal teams prepared integration sequencing documentation for regulatory submission. Everything still looked stable externally. That was the problem. Institutional collapse rarely begins with explosions. It begins with tiny inconsistencies intelligent people pretend not to notice because too much money already depends on optimism surviving another 24 hours. At 4:18 that afternoon, the first crack appeared quietly inside an email chain no executive expected to become important. A federal transportation compliance attorney representing Horizon Transit Systems requested clarification regarding unresolved audit references previously flagged in internal due diligence drafts. Not public yet, not catastrophic yet, but dangerous enough that outside counsel immediately forwarded the inquiry upward toward executive leadership instead of answering independently. Interesting reaction. Lawyers only escalate questions when the liability behind them smells worse than the paperwork describing it. Ethan reportedly dismissed the issue within minutes. Minor disclosure delay. Routine regulatory noise. Proceed normally. Those 3 words would later become very expensive. At 6:22 that evening, another problem surfaced. One financing partner requested updated liability verification tied specifically to Horizon pension obligations previously categorized as non-material exposure during merger forecasting. Non-material. Corporate language becomes almost comedic once billions of dollars start, depending on selective definitions. By then, my phone had started vibrating steadily across the table every 20 minutes. Human resources. legal counsel, acquisition analysts, even one junior vice president from strategic integration attempting nervous small talk before asking whether I could explain certain regulatory assumptions buried inside the merger model. I answered nobody. Not from revenge. From finality. The company already made its decision publicly in front of the board. Now reality would make its decision privately behind closed doors. That night around 11:37, Clara sent one final message before the markets opened again the next morning. 3 words only. You were right. By Wednesday morning, the merger still existed publicly. Technically, financial television continued discussing strategic expansion opportunities while market analysts debated future valuation multiples across transportation automation sectors. But inside Vail Dynamics, the mood had shifted from celebration into controlled anxiety overnight. That happens fast once lawyers stop sounding confident. At 8:02, the first emergency conference call began between outside counsel, acquisition bankers, and the internal legal division after federal transportation auditors requested additional clarification tied to unresolved Horizon Transit Systems compliance inquiries. Not accusations yet. Requests. Corporate America survives on confidence. And confidence starts dying the moment regulators begin asking precise questions. Inside the executive floor, assistants moved faster than usual, while legal teams printed revised disclosure drafts nobody expected to need 48 hours earlier. The atmosphere no longer felt triumphant. It felt defensive. Different energy entirely. Ethan Vail still refused to acknowledge the seriousness publicly. That was his fatal weakness. He treated risk like public relations. I treated risk like gravity. One eventually wins every time. At 9:14, Clara Whitmore entered the executive legal review meeting carrying my final risk escalation summary beneath her arm. The same document Ethan dismissed during the board meeting while firing me in front of everyone. Now every page suddenly mattered. Interesting transformation. People call compliance professionals paranoid right until they need someone to explain why the floor beneath them started cracking. The outside merger counsel reportedly stopped speaking halfway through reviewing the pension exposure section. That detail spread quietly through the executive floor within minutes. Because silence from expensive lawyers terrifies corporations more than shouting ever does. By late morning, another issue surfaced. Hidden labor restructuring obligations tied to Horizon Transit Systems appeared materially larger than the acquisition forecast originally disclosed during financing negotiations. Not accounting fraud technically. Worse, selective omission. That gray zone destroys mergers constantly, because billion-dollar deals depend on one fragile assumption above everything else. Trust. Once trust weakens, financing institutions start protecting themselves immediately. At 11:26, one of the primary acquisition banks paused final debt packaging review pending additional liability verification. Paused. Not canceled. Yet. But inside merger environments, delays spread like blood in water. Everybody smells vulnerability at the same time. Meanwhile, I spent the morning walking along the Chicago River beneath cold October wind, while my phone continued vibrating steadily inside my coat pocket every 15 minutes. Legal counsel, board members, senior finance executives, one private equity intermediary, even Ethan personally twice before noon. I answered nobody. Not because I hated them. Because my role inside that institution already ended the moment ethics became negotiable for convenience. That line matters. Most people think corruption begins with illegal behavior. It does not. It begins when intelligent people convince themselves responsibility can wait until after the deal closes. Around 1:37, financial reporters started asking questions publicly about the unusual delay in Vail Dynamics regulatory filing schedules tied to the acquisition timeline. Tiny article. Small mention. Barely noticeable. Still dangerous. Market panic rarely starts loudly. It starts with whispers between people who understand what procedural hesitation usually means behind closed corporate doors. By mid-afternoon, Ethan convened another emergency executive meeting inside the same boardroom where he terminated me less than 2 days earlier. Different room emotionally now. No celebration catering. No relaxed laughter. No merger victory speeches glowing across giant presentation screens. Only spreadsheets, exposure models, revised legal assessments, and fear. Clara reportedly asked the question nobody wanted answered directly. Did Daniel ever recommend approving this merger under current disclosure conditions? Silence. Then outside counsel answered quietly, no. Another long silence followed immediately afterward. Because for the first time since the merger announcement, everyone in that room understood the same terrifying truth simultaneously. The man they publicly humiliated was not obstructing growth. He was shielding the company from catastrophe. At 4:52, the first acquisition financing institution formally requested temporary suspension rights pending independent federal clarification review. That single email changed everything. The merger was no longer accelerating toward completion. It was drifting toward collapse. And somewhere above downtown Chicago, while executives inside glass offices finally started understanding the scale of their mistake, rain clouds rolled slowly across the skyline exactly the same way they had the morning Ethan Vale called me deadweight in front of the board. Thursday morning opened with silence on the executive floor. Not calm. Suppression. The kind corporations create when too many senior people suddenly realize their careers may become evidence later. At 7:43, the first outside law firm formally recommended delaying the merger closing timeline, pending expanded disclosure verification tied to Horizon Transit Systems liabilities. That recommendation should have ended the acquisition immediately. It did not, because $3.9 billion changes how long people stay irrational. Inside Vale Dynamics headquarters, the atmosphere turned clinical. Coffee untouched. Conference room doors closed. Assistants whispering instead of speaking normally. Legal analysts carrying stacks of revised exposure summaries between executive offices beneath fluorescent lighting that suddenly made everybody look older. Fear ages executives quickly, especially the ambitious ones. At 8:12, financial reporters began calling board members directly instead of going through corporate communications channels. Another dangerous sign. Media only bypasses public relations departments when journalists suspect executives are hiding something important. Clara Whitmore understood that immediately. Most of the board did not. They still believed the situation could be stabilized quietly through revised disclosures and aggressive negotiation. That illusion survived another 90 minutes. At 9:47, Horizon Transit Systems unexpectedly postponed a scheduled integration coordination meeting with Vale Dynamics leadership, citing internal legal review complications. Complications. Corporate language again. Interesting word. Complications means lawyers discovered something expensive. By 10:34, the first internal panic finally surfaced openly during emergency board discussions when acquisition financing analysts confirmed that multiple debt exposure assumptions inside the merger model no longer aligned with revised pension liability estimates. Translation. The math stopped working. That changes everything in corporate finance. Narratives can survive scandals temporarily. They cannot survive broken numbers. Meanwhile, I remained completely outside the storm for the first time in 22 years. No conference calls. No emergency escalation chains. No executive summaries requiring overnight review beneath office lights at 2 in the morning, while everyone else slept comfortably, believing risk management happened magically by itself. Interesting feeling. Silence after decades inside corporate crisis environments feels unnatural initially, then addictive. Around noon, Ethan Vale finally reached me directly through Clara Whitmore. No executive assistant this time. No scheduling formality. Just a message. Please call. Urgent. I looked at the screen for several seconds before placing the phone face down beside my kitchen counter, overlooking gray Chicago rooftops blurred beneath steady autumn rain. 3 days earlier, he publicly erased my career in front of the board. Now urgency existed. Corporate urgency usually arrives exactly 1 hour after accountability becomes financially measurable. At 1:14, another critical failure emerged. Federal transportation regulators requested expanded clarification regarding unresolved operational compliance findings tied to Horizon Transit Systems' regional freight automation infrastructure. Not criminal allegations. Worse, institutional uncertainty. Markets tolerate corruption longer than uncertainty, because uncertainty destroys valuation models instantly. Inside headquarters, outside counsel reportedly advised Ethan directly that proceeding without expanded review now carried material shareholder litigation exposure if additional liabilities surfaced post-acquisition. There it was. The sentence finally entered the room. Litigation exposure. Once lawyers begin protecting themselves verbally, executives start understanding how serious the situation actually became. By late afternoon, Vail Dynamics stock volatility triggered internal risk controls across multiple institutional investment portfolios tied to merger financing assumptions. Another terrible sign. Large investors do not panic emotionally. They reduce exposure mathematically. That is colder, more dangerous. At 4:06, Clara called again. Her voice sounded different this time. Less skeptical, more exhausted. Daniel, they want to know whether this can still be saved. Interesting question. Not whether the merger should proceed, whether it could survive. I walked slowly toward the apartment window while traffic lights reflected against rain-dark streets 6 stories below. Then I answered carefully. The merger was unstable before the announcement. They just removed the only person willing to delay it long enough to expose the liabilities honestly. Silence followed. Then Clara spoke quietly. Ethan still thinks this is negotiable. I almost smiled hearing that. Because executives like Ethan always misunderstand collapse initially. They think disasters are conversations. They are not. Disasters are momentum. And by Thursday evening, the merger no longer belonged to the board, the banks, or the executives pretending they still controlled it. It belonged to reality now. Friday morning arrived colder than the rest of the week. Not weather. Institutionally. By then, everybody inside Vail Dynamics understood the merger was no longer in danger. It was dying. The difference matters. Danger still leaves room for confidence. Dying changes how people speak, move, and protect themselves. At 7:21, the first major acquisition financing institution formally suspended participation pending expanded regulatory clarification and revised liability disclosure review. That single decision shattered the illusion of control remaining inside the executive floor. Because once one bank retreats publicly, others begin calculating escape routes privately. Momentum reverses fast in billion-dollar deals. Inside headquarters, emergency meetings multiplied across every conference room simultaneously, while legal counsel revised exposure language almost hourly. The same executives who spent days celebrating market dominance now spoke in hushed tones about reputational containment and shareholder sensitivity. Interesting transformation. Corporate courage evaporates immediately once bonuses become liabilities. By 8:46, financial media shifted tone completely. No longer historic acquisition. Now, questions surrounding undisclosed obligations. Small wording adjustment. Massive institutional consequence. Stock analysts began reducing confidence ratings before markets fully opened. One investment publication described the merger as structurally unstable pending regulatory clarification. Structurally unstable. Beautiful phrase. Clinical. Cold. Fatal. Around 9:15, Clara Whitmore finally visited me in person. No board vehicle. No corporate escort. Just Clara beneath a dark wool coat, standing outside my apartment building, while morning rain drifted through downtown Chicago like static across glass towers. She looked exhausted. Not physically. Morally. That exhaustion lasts longer. We sat across from each other inside a nearly empty restaurant overlooking the river, while muted television screens above the bar displayed falling Vail Dynamics stock movement beside headlines discussing acquisition uncertainty. Clara placed a folder carefully on the table between us. Restoration proposal. 7-year executive retention contract. 30% compensation increase. Expanded authority over merger oversight. Direct reporting access to the board. Interesting how quickly institutions rediscover your value once collapse becomes measurable. I never opened the folder. Clara watched me quietly before speaking. Ethan says the company needs you back immediately. I looked toward the river outside, while gray water moved beneath steel bridges disappearing into cold morning fog. Then answered calmly. The company did not remove me because it lacked information. It removed me because leadership decided information was inconvenient. Clara said nothing initially, because she knew that was true. That truth poisoned everything now. Not the merger collapse itself. The realization that it never needed to happen. At 10:33, the final blow landed. The lead acquisition financing bank formally froze merger funding pending indefinite federal clarification review and expanded liability reassessment. Indefinite. One word destroyed $3.9 billion. Inside Veil Dynamics, the atmosphere reportedly shifted from crisis management into survival mode within minutes. Public relations teams drafted emergency statements. Legal counsel prepared defensive shareholder communications. Board members started distancing themselves from prior merger approval discussions through carefully revised email language. Classic corporate behavior. Everyone becomes cautious historians once failure turns public. Around noon, Ethan called personally again. This time I answered. Silence greeted the line first. Heavy silence. The kind exhausted executives create after sleeping 2 hours while watching billion-dollar narratives collapse in real time. Then his voice arrived quieter than I had ever heard it before. Daniel, we need to fix this. Interesting sentence. Not. I was wrong. Not. You warned us. Not. I should not have fired you publicly. Just. Fix this. Because men like Ethan still see institutions transactionally even while drowning beneath consequences. I remained calm. The merger cannot be fixed anymore. Another silence. Longer this time. Then he asked the real question finally. Did you know this would happen? I answered immediately. Yes. Not because I was brilliant. Because compliance mathematics are indifferent to executive optimism. Outside my apartment window, the rain intensified against the skyline, while somewhere downtown lawyers, bankers, executives, and board members scrambled desperately through exposure models they should have respected 11 months earlier. But by Friday afternoon, the merger no longer needed enemies. It was collapsing under the weight of truths they tried to rush past. By Friday evening, the merger existed only as legal debris and financial embarrassment. The official collapse statement reached the market at 5:18 Eastern Time. Concise language, strategic reassessment, financing uncertainty, regulatory clarification concerns. Public corporations always describe disasters politely. Reality sounded uglier behind closed doors. $3.9 billion disappeared in less than 72 hours because executives confused momentum with stability. That distinction destroyed them. Across Chicago, financial analysts immediately began rewriting the story publicly. Television commentators who praised Ethan Veil earlier that week now questioned whether leadership ignored material compliance warnings during due diligence review. Interesting thing about Wall Street loyalty. It survives exactly until numbers turn red. Inside Veil Dynamics headquarters, the executive floor reportedly resembled a hospital after mass trauma. Conference rooms occupied continuously. Outside, legal counsel rotating between emergency strategy sessions. Investor relations teams rewriting statements every 20 minutes, while board members demanded internal documentation proving who knew what and when. Nobody celebrated growth anymore. Now everybody hunted liability. That transition always arrives eventually in failing institutions. At 6:42, Clara Whitmore called again. Her voice sounded sharper now, less emotional, more precise. The board wants a complete timeline of every merger warning you submitted over the last year. I stood alone inside my apartment kitchen watching reflected city lights shimmer across rain-covered windows, while evening traffic crawled below like slow-moving veins of red and white through downtown streets. Then I answered calmly. They already have the timeline. Another pause. Then Clara spoke quietly. Daniel, they think shareholder litigation is coming. Of course it was coming. Public humiliation becomes legally dangerous once the humiliated person turns out to be correct professionally, especially when documentation exists. And my documentation always existed. That was the difference between me and executives like Ethan Veil. He managed narratives. I managed evidence. Around 7:31, Ethan arrived personally outside my building without security, assistance, or public relations handlers for the first time since becoming chief executive officer 6 years earlier. Interesting image. One of the most aggressive executives in the logistics sector standing alone beneath cold October rain, looking older than he had 48 hours earlier. Failure accelerates, aging faster than time. I let him inside because curiosity still outweighed resentment. He entered quietly while removing rainwater from his coat, sleeves beneath the muted kitchen lighting. No arrogance left now. No presentation voice. No executive theater. Only exhaustion. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan looked directly at me for the first time all week without performance layered between us. You knew the financing institutions would pull out. Not a question. Recognition. I answered honestly. I knew they would once the liability exposure became impossible to contain verbally. He stared toward the skyline outside my apartment windows before speaking again. Why did nobody else see this? Wrong question. That was still executive thinking. I leaned against the kitchen counter quietly before answering. They saw it. They just convinced themselves the risks could survive until after the merger closed because too much money depended on optimism. Silence returned. Heavy silence. The kind that appears when intelligent people finally understand they were not victims of sabotage. Only consequences. Ethan sat down slowly at the edge of the dining table while city lights flickered across the glass behind him. Then came the sentence he should have asked months earlier instead of firing me publicly in front of the board. Was the merger ever actually viable? I answered immediately. Not under the structure you approved. That truth hit harder than the collapse itself. Because failed executives can survive bad luck emotionally. They struggle surviving preventable failure. I walked toward the bookshelf near the living room and removed a thick black binder filled with compliance models, liability projections, federal correspondence references, and integration risk analyses accumulated over 11 months. Then I placed it carefully on the table in front of him. Every reason the merger failed already existed inside that binder before the board approved the deal. Ethan opened the first page slowly while rain continued tapping against the apartment windows behind us like quiet static. For several minutes, he read silently beneath the warm kitchen light. Then finally he looked up and asked the only honest question left. Why did you keep warning us after we stopped listening? Interesting question. Because the answer had nothing to do with revenge, or ego, or being proven right. I looked directly at him before speaking quietly. Because responsibility does not disappear just because leadership becomes arrogant enough to ignore it. Saturday morning arrived without market noise for the first time all week. No opening bell. No stock movement. No financial television panels pretending certainty still existed. Just silence hanging over Chicago beneath low gray clouds while inside Vail Dynamics the board spent the weekend trying to determine whether the merger collapse was merely catastrophic or legally survivable. Those are very different conversations. By 9:15 outside counsel formally recommended preserving all merger-related communications tied to executive decision-making during due diligence review. Another beautiful corporate phrase. Preserve communications. Translation. Everyone suddenly expects future investigators. Inside headquarters executives who spent months deleting cautionary language from presentations now searched desperately for proof they once sounded responsible privately. Human behavior becomes fascinating once careers start, depending on email history. Meanwhile, I spent the morning reading through old notebooks accumulated over 22 years inside Vail Dynamics. Operational audits. Federal review summaries. Risk escalation diagrams. Handwritten observations from acquisitions that never happened because the numbers failed integrity review. Interesting pattern emerged repeatedly. Every institutional disaster begins with the same sentence eventually. We can deal with that later. Later is where collapse lives. Around 11:30, Clara Whitmore chaired a closed board session without Ethan present for the first time since he became chief executive officer. That detail alone told me how serious the internal fracture had become. Boards remove confidence quietly before they remove executives publicly. The discussion reportedly lasted almost 4 hours. Not about the failed merger anymore. About accountability, which is always the more dangerous conversation. Because failed strategy can survive corporate America. Destroyed trust usually cannot. Clara eventually presented my complete compliance timeline chronologically across the boardroom display systems. Every memo, every legal warning, every pension exposure analysis, every federal inquiry concern, every request for delayed approval review. 11 months of documented resistance against executive acceleration pressure. One board member reportedly asked the question nobody wanted answered honestly. Did Daniel Mercer ever recommend proceeding with the acquisition under existing disclosure conditions? Outside counsel answered immediately, no. Another board member asked whether leadership fully understood the exposure warnings before approving the merger publicly. Longer silence that time. Because truth becomes harder once legal consequences attach themselves to memory. By mid-afternoon, the board finally understood something emotionally devastating. The merger collapse was not caused by hidden information. The information existed. Leadership simply decided optimism sounded more profitable than caution. That distinction changed the entire institutional narrative overnight. At 3:08, Clara arrived at my apartment carrying another folder. Smaller this time. No legal branding. No retention contract language. Just honesty finally stripped down to essentials. We sat beside the windows overlooking the river while weak afternoon light reflected against rain-dark buildings outside. She placed the folder carefully across the table. Independent Advisory Authority. Direct Board Reporting Structure. Compensation Restructuring. Full Executive Restoration. Then she looked directly at me before speaking quietly. The board wants you back immediately. Ethan included. Interesting addition. Ethan included. Meaning even he understood resistance no longer mattered. I never touched the folder. Clara studied me silently for several seconds. Smart enough already to know the answer before asking the question anyway. You are not coming back, are you? I looked toward the skyline where corporate towers disappeared gradually into slow-moving fog beyond the river. Buildings filled with intelligent people still convincing themselves ethics and profitability eventually become the same thing if enough consultants repeat it confidently. Then I answered calmly. No, not emotional. Final. Clara leaned back quietly while absorbing that answer. Then came the real question beneath everything else. Why? Simple answer. Because institutions that punish responsibility during profitable moments rarely transform permanently after consequences arrive. They become temporarily frightened. Huge difference. The room stayed silent afterward except for distant traffic echoing faintly through wet Chicago streets below. Finally, Clara asked one last thing before leaving. What happens to Ethan now? I answered honestly. That depends whether the board wants accountability or a public shield. She nodded slowly because she already understood corporate survival logic herself. Executives rarely fall because they were wrong. They fall because their mistakes became impossible to hide financially. After Clara left, I stood alone near the apartment window watching evening settle slowly across the city, while somewhere downtown the same boardroom, where Ethan called me deadweight, now searched desperately for a way to survive the truth they once mocked publicly. By Monday morning, the merger disaster had evolved into something far more dangerous for Vail Dynamics. Narrative collapse. Financial damage can sometimes recover. Institutional credibility rarely does. The markets opened brutally. Analysts downgraded executive confidence ratings, while shareholder groups demanded explanations regarding ignored compliance warnings tied to the failed acquisition. Financial journalists no longer described Ethan Vail as visionary. Now they used words like reckless. That transition alone probably cost him more emotionally than the merger itself. Because executives built on public admiration become fragile once applause disappears. Inside headquarters, the executive floor no longer resembled a growth company. It resembled a containment operation. Crisis consultants moved between conference rooms carrying exposure assessments, while outside counsel coordinated communication protocols for anticipated shareholder actions. Interesting atmosphere. Nobody spoke about dominance anymore. Only damage control. At 9:27, Ethan released an internal company statement describing the merger collapse as an unfortunate strategic outcome resulting from evolving regulatory complexities. Classic executive language. Complicated enough to sound intelligent. Empty enough to avoid accountability. Employees did not believe him. That mattered more than the press response eventually. Because internally everybody already understood something leadership could no longer hide. Daniel Mercer warned them repeatedly. And leadership punished him for it publicly. That story spread through the company faster than any official communication ever could. Truth usually does. Around noon, I met Clara Whitmore for lunch at a quiet restaurant overlooking the north branch of the river, while weak winter sunlight reflected across cold steel buildings outside. She looked calmer now. Not because the crisis improved. Because the illusion finally died. There is relief hidden inside certainty sometimes. Even terrible certainty. She reviewed the latest board developments carefully while stirring untouched coffee beside the window. 3 independent directors want Ethan removed before quarterly earnings calls begin. Outside counsel believes shareholder actions are almost guaranteed. Several institutional investors are demanding governance review hearings. I listened quietly without interruption. Not satisfaction. Observation. Clara eventually stopped speaking and studied me directly across the table. You still do not seem angry. Interesting statement. Most people misunderstand emotional control completely. They think calm means absence of damage. It does not. It means the damage stopped controlling you. I looked outside toward the river traffic moving slowly beneath low gray clouds before answering. Anger would imply surprise. That answer stayed between us for several seconds. Then Clara asked something softer, more human. Did any part of you want the merger to succeed anyway? Simple question. Dangerous answer. Because the truth was yes. Of course I wanted the company to survive responsibly. I spent 22 years building risk architecture specifically to prevent disasters exactly like this one. People think compliance officers enjoy saying no. We do not. We enjoy institutions surviving reality. I answered quietly. I wanted the company to slow down long enough to survive the truth honestly. Clara nodded once slowly while understanding settled visibly across her face. That was the tragedy underneath everything. Not greed alone. Impatience. Corporate America worships acceleration so aggressively that caution now looks suspicious instead of intelligent. Later that afternoon, Ethan called again, unexpectedly. No executive tone left anymore. Just fatigue. He asked whether we could meet privately one final time. I agreed. Not for negotiation. For closure. We met after sunset inside a nearly empty executive lounge overlooking downtown Chicago, where city lights reflected endlessly across black glass and polished marble beneath dim amber lighting. Ethan looked exhausted. Older somehow. Not physically. Structurally. He sat across from me silently for several moments before finally speaking. The board thinks I ignored you because of ego. I waited quietly. Then he continued. Maybe they are right. Interesting moment. Not redemption. Recognition. There is a difference. He looked down toward the whiskey untouched beside his hand. Then asked the question that mattered more than everything else finally. At what point did you realize we stopped listening to reality? I answered honestly. The moment risk became treated like an obstacle to valuation instead of protection against collapse. Silence settled heavily across the lounge afterward while traffic lights moved far below the skyscrapers like distant circuitry beneath cold night rain. Then Ethan asked one final question without looking at me. What are you going to do now? For the first time all week, I allowed myself the smallest hint of something resembling peace. Then answered quietly. Build something where integrity is not considered resistance. 6 months later, the boardroom looked smaller. Not physically, morally. The same 62nd floor conference room where Ethan Vale called me deadweight in front of investment bankers and board members now carried a different atmosphere entirely. Quieter, more careful. Failure leaves residue inside institutions, especially public failure. Vale Dynamics survived the merger collapse technically, but the company never fully recovered its old mythology afterward. Shareholder litigation forced governance restructuring. 2 independent directors resigned quietly. External oversight increased. Quarterly earnings calls became defensive exercises instead of victory performances. And Ethan Vale remained chief executive officer. Temporarily. That part interested me most. Corporate America rarely removes executives immediately after catastrophic decisions. First, it measures whether blame can be isolated conveniently without destabilizing investor confidence further. Executives are protected until protection becomes more expensive than sacrifice. Eventually, the board reached that calculation too. By early spring, Ethan announced his resignation publicly, citing strategic transition priorities and leadership continuity considerations. Another polished corporate phrase hiding institutional exhaustion beneath elegant wording. Financial media called it fallout from the failed acquisition disaster. Employees called it inevitability. Both were correct. Meanwhile, my own life moved in the opposite direction completely. Quietly. No press release. No dramatic launch campaign. No triumphant interviews about redemption or revenge. Just work. The Mercer Advisory Group began inside a small office overlooking the Chicago River with 4 employees, 2 former federal compliance attorneys, and 1 simple operating principle written across the internal conference room wall. Reality first. Interesting how revolutionary honesty becomes once entire industries normalize optimism as strategy. Within months, private equity firms, logistics companies, transportation manufacturers, and even competing acquisition boards started requesting independent merger risk reviews from my team specifically because we had one reputation nobody else wanted initially. We delayed deals. That frightened aggressive executives. It attracted responsible ones. Turns out mature institutions value truth differently after watching enough competitors collapse publicly. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Clara Whitmore visited the office unexpectedly while analysts inside the conference room reviewed acquisition exposure models projected across digital screens beneath soft white lighting. Different environment entirely from Veil Dynamics. No performance energy. No executive theater. Only disciplined scrutiny. Clara stood near the glass, overlooking the river, quietly observing the room before speaking. You built the company you wanted them to become. Interesting observation. Because she was right. I never wanted revenge against Veil Dynamics itself. I wanted responsibility to matter more than momentum. That was always the real conflict. Not personalities. Philosophy. Later that evening, after everyone left, I remained alone inside the office reviewing a transportation merger assessment while rain tapped steadily against the windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Same city, different life. My phone buzzed once beside the desk with a financial news alert announcing another delayed corporate acquisition somewhere in New York after expanded liability review concerns surfaced during due diligence. Smaller story, barely national news. Still important, because somewhere inside another boardroom, someone probably hated the cautious person slowing down the deal. And somewhere months later, that same cautious person might become the only reason the institution survives reality intact. That is the irony executives never understand early enough. The people protecting corporations from collapse rarely sound inspirational. They sound inconvenient. Too detailed. Too careful. Too slow. Until the collapse finally arrives. Then suddenly everyone asks why nobody warned them sooner. I looked across the dark office while city lights reflected against rain-covered glass exactly the same way they had the morning Ethan Vale terminated me in front of the board. Funny thing about that moment now. Losing the job felt catastrophic initially. But sometimes institutions reveal their true values most clearly when profit collides directly with integrity. And once you see that clearly enough, staying becomes harder than leaving ever was. The merger did not die because I destroyed it. It died because reality eventually demanded honesty from people who spent too long treating truth like an obstacle to valuation. That is how most institutional disasters actually happen. Not through sabotage, through arrogance accelerated by money. And in the end, the most dangerous person in a corporation is usually not the loudest executive in the room. It is the quiet individual still willing to tell the truth after everybody else starts getting paid to ignore it.